Hello, welcome to another Black Horizons program. We're glad that you could join us. I'm your host, Hamid Rasheed. Last week we touched in our program on the topic of the developing countries of Africa and the international economic system. We touched in a summary fashion in that program on some of the structural problems at the international level which are adversely impacting on the economic development of many African countries. In today's program, we will discuss in greater detail and examine some of the prescriptions necessary to correct some of these structural problems. I have joining me once again on the program Celestine Bassey of the Political Science Department at Dalhousie University. Celestine, welcome back to part two of our programs dealing with this question of African countries and the international economic system. One of the things that we touched on in a cursory fashion last week in our introductory program in the series was the role of the multinational. I'd like to come back to the question of the multinationals and ask you what has been the role and the impact of multinationals on developing countries in Africa.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question because the role of the multinational corporations, in the development of third world countries, including African countries, has been very controversial, both in the informed academic circle, and but also at the public circle, in these countries. And we discovered that, the operation of the multinational corporation in the international economic system is not new, but had actually taken, quite a different turn after this First World War. And about the developing countries of Africa, there was a time in the early 60s, and 70s when it was thought, that these multinational corporations do contribute positively, to the development of this country. But now, in retrospect, we're really having a second opinion about it, and there are many scholars, decision makers, including leaders like Tanzania Julius Nyerere, and also, of course, that other leaders, within Africa, like Nkrumah, who popularized the term neocolonialism, have actually highlighted, their damaging impact, of the operation of multinationals. While we can actually take it specifically, we all know, the importance of capital, for instance, in the development of any country. We saw the operation of capital both in North America and in Europe, in the early industrial era. We know, for instance, that Great Britain had to involve itself in the peculiar institution of slavery and slave trade in order to raise the capital for its development. We know that in the United States, in spite of the statement of Ronald Reagan that Congress had to intervene massively, in the 19th century to give the capital needed for development. And we also know that in these countries that have been held static, especially in the colonial era, that if they have to industrialize, to a certain extent, at least develop to the extent of being able, to gain control of their domestic economies and provide elementary welfare infrastructures, to its people, that capital is very much necessary. And this year we're told that, the capital provided by the multinational had been of a very great help, in the development of this country. But I do take an issue, with that because the more you look into the operations of the multinational corporations, the more you see that what they actually provide is not capital as such. In fact, they even contribute, to denying these countries, the capital availability, for their own indigenous entrepreneurial development. While we find that, the multinational, what they do according to the strategy, which is actually to gain control of the domestic markets in these countries, that they actually go into this country. And considering their range of collateral, they're able to raise the necessary capital locally from the local banks, most of whom are owned by foreign corporations. They raise the capital there, then set up whatever industries they want from local capital, and then transfer the profits, back to their mother country or the metropolitan country. So as far as capital is concerned, in fact, instead of providing capital as such, to this country to meet their own pattern of development. They use available capital within this country to set up, industries, which of course, in many ways, only contribute, to the perpetuation of the dependent cycle, because what they actually produce, like luxurious cars, television and other things, only benefits the elites of this country. The masses of this country that may contribute about 80% of the population, actually end up, on the marginal welfare of the contributions of the multinational corporation. Well, it's the same thing with capital, technology. Well, we are always told that, by transferring capital, technology to this country, these countries do not have to start afresh. They already have available technology. But what you really find is that there's always a clause, restricting the use of this technology in these countries, so that maybe a car assembled in Zaire, for instance, could not be sold to the neighboring states of Africa, because the whole objective of the multinational corporation had been to gain the market of Zaire, by introducing its own assembly line there, and not allowing Zaire, to sell these cars in order not to create any competition for itself. This has happened. Nigeria, for instance, has 4 assembly lines, for cars, involving Mercedes, French Peugeots, Beetles, and others, But there's, unlike, Canadian-American relation, where an American an American car could be assembled here in Canada and sold to Iraq, for instance. Such things are often very much unheard of, in developing country, because of this type of restriction placed on technological export. The third damaging thing is what scholars have called marketplace ideology. That because of the pattern of advertisement, of the multinationals, in these countries, certain tastes had been propagated, like goods of ostentation, colored TV, luxurious cars, and all sorts of products that are developed here in the Western world, and to a certain extent, the consumer society here could cope with. But in the developing country, where the masses of people are barely struggling, to gain their livelihood, it is only the elites who constitute maybe less than 10% of the population that end up benefiting, from this sort of luxurious group. Of course, to have a colored television, you'll know it entails, the massive financial inputs from the part of government to establish the infrastructures. I'm not against communication in itself. In fact, the spread of television program in countries like Nigeria had helped, to create a sense of national identity, so that one part of the country knows what is going on with the other part of the country. But this is okay as long as, the decision makers also raise their own indigenous skills, to take control and develop, the necessary infrastructures which they are doing, and also the TV's assembly line, which they now have the technical know-how. But now the elites of this country have almost turned into what might call a middle class importers, for the developing countries. They gain this thing into the country, and the 10% will be paid into their bank account overseas. So instead of investing in the development of television and other industrial infrastructures that are needed, the elites now serve as a commercial middleman, between the population and the multinational corporation. So what we're now seeing in these countries as consequences, we're now seeing, like in Zaire, where inflation is now running at the level of almost 800%.
800%?
Almost 800%. That, this a massive involvement of the multinational in Zaire, for instance, in the early 70s, when copper, for instance, was doing quite well on the world market, has created a situation of debt and a cycle of dependence, And what we really have is that, the United States now has virtually taken over, the financial planning of Zaire, in order to, as a condition for backing up the credits, from the International Monetary Fund, to get Zaire out of this massive loan, that the country had been thrown into. But again, if you look at it very closely, who actually did benefit, from this massive infusion of so-called aid that we may touch upon later, it has been the elites. And Mobutu himself, the president, has been ranked as one of the richest men in the world. This money is not invested in his country. It ends up in Europe and Switzerland and the United States. So these are the pattern of dependence, that the involvement of the multinational corporations, have actually created in many of these countries, and which we hope that, with the present development, of course, many decision makers in Africa are coming to realize it. They're coming to realize that the shout of Nkrumah about neocolonialism was not just a shout, of just a person with a Marxist-Leninist brain, that he was very much aware of the dangers, this type of dependence and massive penetration of multinational was going to create for African countries. So while, for instance, many African countries do need the multinational, but the operation and also the bargaining should be done at the basis of quid pro quo, while the multinationals do benefit, and also African countries do benefit from the multinational. But a situation should be created and the rules of the game should be established that both the population of these countries also benefit, from the involvement of the multinational in these countries. As Brandit pointed out in his report, what the present world really needs is interdependence, but not the operation of dependence, that is very much perpetuated in these countries through the multinationals. And we, of course, know that I don't need to cite some of the statistics given by Dr. Sober, that states like Mali only gain about 15% of their mining of the minerals, in Mali. Why? Because, most of the profit goes to the multinational that controls both the mining, the packaging, and also the shipping and the marketing of these products in the developed countries. So it is this situation of dependence, that has been very much highlighted, by the events of these countries in the 70s.
So then the role of the multinationals as they've existed at this point hasn't been a very positive one. And you touched in your comments on the dependency that's created. Mm-hmm. This brings me to this whole examination of this whole question of aid. I've heard somebody say when looking at this question of aid is that it's not unlike the situation of the junkie for making heroin available in order to build up a dependency. Yeah. Would you concur with that analogy as it relates to the question of aid and with particular reference to developing countries of Africa?
Yeah, well, I mean, aid now, what we now call aid, we just have to put it in inverted comma, as most writers, especially from the developing countries have done. But because what we really call aid is not aid as such. First of all, it could involve, what you've cited, the development of tests, in these countries, which again would augment imports of these countries from the countries of origins of this multinational. This is what aid has contributed, what they call the marketplace ideology. So they create a certain test within these countries, and then the list of these countries then who have now become dependent on this sort of products, are going to rely on the massive imports, of these particular products, from the developed countries. I mean, an example could be given of Nigeria. For instance, in the 70s, Mercedes-Benz, had become, part of the status, the status, status of orientation in this particular country. Now, while the military government of the time saying that, a test had now been created for Mercedes, what they did was to move towards at least having an assembly line so that the Nigerians in general, through employment, contribution of employment and also taxation, could derive some benefit. But again, they did place a limit, on their patents and particular brands of Mercedes that had to be produced in Nigeria. Anything beyond the 2000 cc, the Mercedes 230 and 280 was not allowed to be assembled in the country. But the military was able to enforce that because they had to do that through decrees. But what happened when the military handed over power about 3 years ago in 1979 to the civilian? Everything was back to square one. I mean, the Mercedes automatic 450 was being imported, So what they at least do is to invest abroad, their money abroad, import these cars and sell them at a very, very astronomical price. And again, funnel that money again through a central bank and send it overseas. So this shows you the extent to which what had been described as marketplace ideology had contributed to the dependence, of this country. This could be a very indirect one, but the indirect results had been very much what even the developed countries of the West had experienced. That's the difficulty in controlling this multinational corporation itself. They have a strategy, involving, like underpricing exports from this country. If they set up a plant, in any African country and want to export some spare parts from it, back to the developed country as they're doing in Hong Kong and other Asian countries, what they're going to do is to underprice the export and then overprice the imports and give false statistics, about their profits. In fact, this is what the American administration and Congress have been trying to wrestle with. So the multinationals have grown so powerful, both in terms of communication, of control of civil technology and other communications, that even many of the developing countries of Africa have to rely on the multinational for their own source of data. So if you have to rely on the very people who exploit you for your source of information, then you've actually opened yourself to more exploitation. So this is exactly what we see. In fact, it has been estimated by an American scholar, Charles Wilbur, that between the period of 1979 and 82, where the total exports of the African countries could be placed at about 300 billion, that these countries only benefited only 30 billion, that the rest goes to the multinational and also to the shipping company and the marketing company that controls, the products of this country. So this had led to the charge that what the Western industrial countries are actually doing is to apply welfare economics to their own societies, an economics that has seen the establishment of social security to protect their workers, establish farm subsidies for farmers, and holding of the farm products artificially high in order to give a certain livelihood standards to their farmers. Now, this is what we call welfare economics, which is actually the application of socialist principle to a capitalist society in order to maintain its survival. But in the case of developing countries, while they're applying welfare economics to their society, they're applying almost a pre-Keynesian economics, to the developing countries, particularly of Africa. Now that the products of these countries should be determined by the market forces. And when of course, the excess of agricultural products and other raw materials, that these countries have to export, then of course, that that the prices of their goods will be held at absurdly and outrageously low standard, which again would not allow this country independently to raise the capital, because of the poor performance of their raw material, in order to create other infrastructures within their country that may be needed for development. So it's a pattern of a cycle of dependence that have been very much created through both the operation of the multinational corporations and also the pattern of trade, that in terms of the relation of most African countries to the international economic market that is, as we all know, dominated by the industrial giants of the West, including Japan, of course.
Well, I'd like to take the remaining time that we have left in today's program to look at some of the strategies that might be adopted by the developing countries of Africa and other third world developing countries to counteract some of the adverse impact of the multinationals, the pattern of trade, the dependency that has been created as a result of the aid situation and so on. We said in last week's program that much of what we have been talking about was touched on in a paper presented by Dr. Ozabai at the conference that was held in May by the Canadian Centre of African Studies. Dr. Ozabai, in terms of looking at some of the problems we've been discussing, what prescriptions did she suggest that perhaps could be pursued to deal with some of these structural problems that we've been discussing?
Yes, Dr. Suba recapitulated some of the strategies that the developing countries, what we call the South, had been trying to adopt, while at the same time introducing and emphasizing things that have been to a certain extent of novel origin in terms of the strategies of these countries, especially the African countries. Well, it has been considered all along that one way of reducing the cycle of dependence, and the situation of peripheral situation of African countries is to encourage what we call the South-South trade, the link to encourage trade, between these countries, as of Africa and other countries of Latin America and Asia. This is what we call the horizontal link in trade pattern. So this could lead towards what might call partial disengagement, of dependence, with the West. So since, for instance, it may be easier for a country of Africa, to negotiate and industrial technology with Brazil, it will not be similarly easy to do so with Britain or any of the North American countries. So one of the strategy was to encourage the horizontal link, between the African countries, and other countries of the South, which have been called the newly industrializing countries. That's including Nigeria itself. But the Soba has also argued that while these countries, the southern bloc, should step up, their demand for the reforms, what we call the new international economic order, for the reform of the world economic system, by, for instance, increasing, the share of the developing country, in their distribution of international monetary reserves, in the IMF, because presently, as was indicated, between 75 and 79, out of the 131 billion, that was available, available from the credit loan that was available from the International Monetary Fund, that developing countries that actually constitute more than 70% of the world population only end up having a share of less than 4% of the 131 billion between 75 and 79. The rest went to the developing countries because they have a larger share of the vote. I mean, don't forget that this institution was set up by them at the Dumbarton Oaks when most of these countries were still colonies, and then they have the veto power to block whatever policies that they didn't find amenable to themselves. So while Dr. Suba says, pressure should, this country should keep up pressure, for reforms within the international regimes, as we've seen with the law of the sea, that they cannot afford also that they cannot really afford, to delegate all their resources to fighting, for the reforms of international economic order, that the immediate concern of this country should be to reform their own national order, to be able to get involved, with the elementary needs, of its people, that at this time, for instance, countries of Africa should not be importing food. So all efforts should be made towards, the production of food to a level that could support its indigenous population, and also to establish what might call appropriate technology, or what we call reverse technology, as is presently being used in China. We learned that the Toyota company produces about 100,000 of its trucks every year through the use of reverse technology. That's using less capital-intensive method and more labor-intensive method that is available to this country. So the attempt should be to reform the domestic order, to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, which has been very astronomical in many of the African countries. That's the elites and the masses, and move towards elementary methods, of creating, infrastructures that would contribute to what might call the trickling of the wealth of the country right down to the masses. And some of the ways that had been proposed and had been implemented, of course, by many African countries, Nigeria, for instance, is to allow, to a certain extent, a level of free education in that country, so that at least the poor of the countries, could benefit from that, and also Medicare and other elementary technology towards irrigation system, for instance, in the Mali and Chad region, which could benefit at least the 60 or 70% of the population, rather than the investment of money in the export of luxury goods, which only the elites only benefit in this country. So efforts, according to Dr. Suba, should be directed towards the reform of domestic order, while at the same time this country should step up their pressures to increase their level of participation in the international regimes that actually determines the international economic order.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, I'd like to close out the program with I guess, a philosophical bent of sorts. I guess about 100 years, a little over 100 years ago, not quite 100 years, I guess, Karl Marx has predicted that the contradictions, rather, in capitalism would ultimately bring about its collapse. A couple of nights ago, Ronald Reagan indicated that many of the problems that were being encountered, particularly in the United States, were a result of quasi-socialist measures introduced as part of the New Deal by Roosevelt. Then we have many of the countries of the Third World who are urging the formation of a new international economic order. How do we sort all of this out? We've got about 2 minutes left in today's program. How do you sort all this out? What model do we have to follow in the future?
Well, I mean, one could excuse Karl Marx because he actually made his statement, within the, his historical context of the time,
Yes.
when classical capitalism applied, to much of what we call the present capitalist state. But with the rise of labor powers of the West, much has changed and had been adapted. So while I could excuse Karl Marx, it's just that I find it difficult to understand, this simplistic statement of President Ronald Reagan. I mean, if I see it in the context of the statement he has made so far, about, the socialist principle and socialist wall, I really feel that I'm just one of those who share the principle that, he's simply ignorant, of the operations, of the international economic order and the relation of the communist world, to other blocks, within the international economic system. What I would say is that, both capitalism and socialism no longer exist, in its classical form. Capitalism needs socialism to survive, and we've seen that. I mean, elementary principles, like the New Deal, which of course transfer the powers from the states of the United States to the federal government in terms of the management of the economy, central planning, an eye on the index of inflation, and also in terms of subsidy to farmers, what we call social security system. These are all socialist principles that have been applied to capitalism. Without that, I don't think capitalism could have survived the way it is, and much of this had to be ascribed to the rise of labor power here in the West, and also especially in Britain. In the same manner, also, socialism no longer exists in its classical forms. Marxist-Leninist principle. We have seen that in the Soviet Union as well as in China. There's an attempt now towards, according some initiatives, to individuals, in the economy in order to increase productivity. And in fact, Lenin himself was extremely farsighted in this. We have to remember that when Lenin, after the Bolshevik Revolution,
Yes.
Lenin introduced the new economic principle whereby the state only controls, as in Britain now, what he calls the pillars of the economy, the mineral resources and other major industries like shipping, which is what is happening in Britain today, while at the secondary level, initiative is allowed to the individuals. And we also see that under Khrushchev, and his peaceful coexistence, attempt had been made, to minimize, the confrontationist policy between the two camps. While of course we find Reagan now still accusing, the Soviet bloc of wanting to propagate turning the whole world into a communist world. It's just like blaming the United States that once in its history it has the ideology of manifest destiny. So that we still think that because the United States had this ideology, so that U.S. want to conquer the world. I mean, that would be as silly, as trying to accuse the Soviet Union. So I think this is just the situation. None of the system exists in its classical forms.
Mm-hmm.
So
what we really need to do is we really have to wrestle with this whole concept of a new international economic order, which is somewhere in between these two extremes.
Yeah, the international economic order is quite a pragmatic, approach to show that, the world had become so interdependent now that other countries should not be treated as being solely dependent on one part of the world, that if to prevent the collapse of the whole economic order, that an attempt should be made to maximize the participation of all the components in the economic system, different subsystems and different people, to have a share in the system. That's the only way the system could be maintained.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll have to leave it at that because we've
Okay.
exhausted our time. Maybe that's a program in itself. We want to thank you for being our guest. Join us next week, won't you? Hello, welcome to another Black Horizons program. I'm your host, Hamid, Rasheed. And today we'll be talking with three presidents of cultural awareness youth groups in various schools in Halifax County. The Cultural Awareness Program of the Black United Front has been operating in the metro area since January of 1982 under the direction of David Woods, who is the coordinator of the program. Over the past few months, David has been successful in creating at least 9 youth groups in various schools in Halifax County. These youth groups have benefited from the activities of the Cultural Awareness Program. I have joining me today, as I mentioned earlier, 3 presidents of 3 of these groups. First of all, I have Kristal Johnson, who is the president of the Black Cultural Awareness Group of Queen Elizabeth High School. Next to Kristal is Michael Carter, who is president of the United Black Voices, the Black Youth Organization of J.L. Isley School in Spryfield. And next to Michael is Inez Gage, president of the Black Youth Organization at Dartmouth High School. And finally, we have David Woods, who is the cultural coordinator of the Black Cultural Awareness Program. Welcome to all of you to the Black Horizons program. David, I wonder first of all if I could have you, I know we had you on the program several months ago when you were getting your project started, but I wonder if I could ask you once again, just in a nutshell, to give us an idea of what the objectives of the Cultural Awareness Program are.
The major objective of the Cultural Awareness Program is to develop a sense of pride and self-understanding among blacks in the local area. Many of our schools, for example, don't have black history and do very little in terms of addressing many of the problems that affect us as black people in Nova Scotia. And so the project is designed to promote a number of activities, whether it be films, workshops, guest speakers, in which blacks can have a greater sense of understanding their past and present, in which they can discuss problems and find effective solutions to them. So that's basically what the project is about.
Well, now, you've spent a lot of time in organizing groups in the schools. Why did you place emphasis on starting groups in the schools as opposed to going another route? And did you encounter any difficulties in establishing these groups in the schools?
I think mainly when I considered establishing the project, the option was either establishing the groups entirely within the black communities or in another setting, such as the schools. I felt that the schools would be a better option to use, primarily because within the community, if we establish groups within the community, the activities are directed only within the black community. They primarily will leave the boundaries between blacks and non-blacks intact, and there's very little contact outside of the community in terms of the institutions like the school and the government. Establishing groups within the schools, you find that to establish them, we have to get the approval of the school boards and the school administration so that they all approve. You also find that there's greater opportunity for blacks and non-blacks to have meaningful and positive contact through the groups discussing their different problems. Within the school, you also find that by bringing in guest speakers and doing different activities, there's a greater cultural sharing. Also, blacks who traditionally have not felt a strong sense of place within white-dominated institutions can now go to the schools and find that they do feel as if they have somewhere to go that's recognized by the school administration. So that I felt that within the schools we can have groups whose activities can benefit the community but still also have an important role within the schools, whereas within the community it's basically an all-black thing that has very little contact with the outside community. So that's why I decided to use the schools.
Right. Well, I'd like to pass over to you, Inez. You're the president of the Dartmouth High group. I understand that your youth group was created prior to the Cultural Awareness Program coming into existence. I wonder if perhaps I could ask you to give us a little bit of background on your group. When was it created? What were the circumstances involved in the creation of your group? I know that you produce a magazine and so on. Could you tell us something about your group, I guess, which is really one of the oldest groups?
Well, our group was created in 1978 by the former black students, and the circumstances involved was to protect the rights of the individuals of the black minority at Dartmouth High and to keep them in touch with the black community. events in the black communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, your group, as I mentioned, produces a magazine, I think it's called Black Voice. Could you tell us a little bit about your magazine? How do you produce it, and how often, and so on?
Yes, our magazine is produced once a year, and in this magazine we try to reach out and touch almost anyone, I guess. And in this magazine we have music, songs, that is, and history, and recipes, and things that goes on around the community.
Mm-hmm. And the paper's produced solely by the
Black students
themselves. You do all of the printing and all of the writing of the articles and so on.
Yeah.
Right. In addition to the paper, are there other activities that you've become involved in this past year?
Yeah, this year so far we've hosted a leadership development and cultural awareness workshop, and we've had speakers such as Ricky Anderson, Burnley Jones, Sylvia Hamilton, and Fred Ward. And we've also, well, we were supposed to have a bake sale, but I guess the year went by too fast.
Mm-hmm.
And we were trying to work on a play, but it isn't thoroughly finished yet.
Mm-hmm.
But we hope to put it on by next fall.
Right. Will your group continue to operate over the summer, or will, now that school is out, will you not have any activities until the fall?
Well, it's hard to say because most of the students either working or going on vacation, so I guess we'll resume in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to pass over to you, Michael. As I mentioned, you're the president of the United Black Voices, the youth organization at J.L. Isley School in Spryfield. That's an interesting name. Could you tell me how the group arrived at this choice of name?
Well, we were told beforehand to think of ideas, and we voted on the different ideas that were presented before the group, and we chose United Black Voices because we feel that it best reflects our mandate, which is to foster a stronger black identity in our school, which is something that is needed very much.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, is the program or the activities that you are involved in as part of the youth group, are these programs just for black students in the schools, in your case, in J.L. Isley School, or can non-blacks benefit from the activities of your organization as well?
Well, we are a new group. We're only 1 or 2 months old, so we are pretty unorganized. But we are working on a play, which we hope to be finishing and handing over to David so he can develop it a little better, make it a little bit more professional,
Mm-hmm.
which would help all people throughout the community.
Mm-hmm. So then your activities are not solely directed towards the blacks. They have some benefit for the larger community as well.
Definitely.
Well, we've saved the best for last. Kristal Johnson, you're the president of the QEH group. Mm-hmm. I understand that you recently put together a display on black culture in history for your school. I recall seeing the picture of some of the students that were involved in the Chronicle Herald. Can you tell us a bit about how you decided on this particular project?
Well, we want to share what we have learned through the group with the rest of the school, and show them what we've learned through our group. So we decided that putting on a display would be the best way to do it. So we got together and organized a display and put it on. And in our display we had books such as Roots and Africville and That Lonesome Road. We had carvings, clothing from Africa, a map of the communities in Nova Scotia, black communities, and pictures of religious goings-on, community events, things like that.
How was the display generally received by the students at Queen Elizabeth High School, both the black and the white students?
Oh, everybody was commenting on how we presented it. Everybody liked it.
Did you feel that you personally or your group, did you learn anything new as a result of the work that you did in preparing the display?
Mm-hmm.
For example, the black communities. Were you aware where all these black communities were located before you got involved in in the production of the display?
No, I didn't know there were so many.
Yeah, there's quite a few of them, aren't there?
Oh, yeah.
About 4 of them across the province. In addition to the display that we've just been discussing, what other kinds of activities has your group been involved in, or what plans do you have for future activities?
Well, we just started our group in April also, and so far we put on a big sale, and we saw a film called The Fields of Endless Day, and we put on a display and had a quiz on black culture and history. That's basically it. And we're also putting on a play, organizing a play over the summer. So we will be going on through the summer.
Well, Michael, I didn't chat with you too much about the activities of your group. Could you perhaps, you mentioned about the play and that kind of thing, but are there other kinds of things that your group has done or are contemplating? You mentioned that your group is only a couple of months old, so I guess you're still pretty much getting things together, but are there other kinds of things that you've done or that you're contemplating doing in the very near future?
Well, aside from the play, we have had a bake sale, and we've seen a couple movies, Field of Endless Day and It's 7 Shades of Pale, and we enjoyed especially the one, Field of Endless Day, which brought into view, clear view, a lot of the things that happened to blacks and how they got to Canada and what they had when they got here. And we also were honored to have Ricky Anderson as a guest speaker.
Well, did you have any, like Inez, not Inez, but Kristal, rather, their display was somewhat of a special project. Have you had any, I understand that you did have an interesting project that you undertook as part of your activities as well. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, that was the play. We were looking at something for a long-range project, so we decided on the play, which one of our members wrote, and we are presently now developing that, working on it, trying to work it into something which is presentable to the community.
Well, now, Inez, how do you feel that groups, such as the group at Dartmouth High or the other groups in the other schools in the county, how do you feel that these groups can benefit black students?
Well, I think it benefits the black students because it brings them closer together to work and to express their feelings, about the way they're being treated as blacks in the majority white school. And we also learn through our groups to a bit more about our history, because this is something that we fail to get through our school curriculum. And it helps us a bit, because most of the things we've heard about black people in the past were always negative, and when we look back, there's been pretty good black people around. They did pretty good things, and this through our group we learned to see ourselves as not as they see us, but as we see ourselves as a good person, right?
Well, now, Kristal or Michael, do you either of you have anything that you want to add to what Inez has just commented in terms of the benefits? What do you see as being the benefits from participating in groups such as the ones that you have in your schools?
I see also, she said that blacks among blacks, they realize they have a strong identity of who they are and where they're going.
Yes.
But also, it helps to break down the barriers in schools between blacks and non-blacks, because they get to see that through this organized group that there are very little differences in people of any race and any kind. So it helps a lot in relations between the races.
Kristal, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, they basically said it all.
I see. Well, now, David, it seems that your project is off to a good start. From the activities that the group has been describing here this afternoon, it seems that they're getting involved in some solid kinds of activities. What sort of things can we look for in the upcoming future? Where do you go from here with the Black Cultural Awareness Program?
Of course, we can only make plans now, and hopefully, with the appropriate funding, that we'll be able to do these. But one of the things that we're looking forward to next year is, since we do have a number of groups now, and we will hopefully be establishing groups in those areas that we haven't contacted, is that we have a sort of an organized competition among all these groups, in which for them to take part in the cultural awareness project, they will have to do a certain number of activities, both within their school and in their community. One of those things will be to put on a display, another one will be to do a magazine, other things will be to take part in the Black Youth Parliament. Points will be allocated for each event that they put on, and at the end of the year we'll have a trophy awarded to the school that's the best. In addition to the organized competition, we will have developed a more extensive list of films and guest speakers and different events like that for the different groups. We will organize community interaction trips where we find that many blacks now are growing up outside of the rural black communities, and a lot of blacks in other communities don't have an understanding of the different things that affect our communities. So we'll organize trips whereby blacks can get an exposure to communities that they haven't been involved in before. We will also like to start a show which I hope to call Quest for Identity, and it's based on similar to the Reach for the Top that we see on regular TV. And that show we will have a sort of a knowledge quiz between the different groups, with the questions based primarily on black culture and history in both Nova Scotia and worldwide. And we hope to have that underway. And on top of that, we will have, as these groups are doing different plays, the activities that come out of the organized groups, and we'll be doing that on an ongoing basis. So we hope to get all these things off the ground. Another idea that I hope to be working on is a Black Culture and History Certificate, in which we will develop a sort of a Black Culture and History test, and the person who successfully passes it will get a Black Culture and History Certificate, especially made up for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, now I think it was Kristal that referred to the quiz that you had, the Black History quiz, I believe, at QEH. Was this something that was only done at QEH, or has this been done right across the board?
Well, as I said, most of these groups have only recently started, but I sort of, in doing a lot of research as I've had to do for this project, it was just overwhelming, the number of facts that no one ever talks about, but that are included in Black culture and history. And so what I did was devise a short quiz of information that, some things that they should have known and some things that they should know even if they've never heard of. So what we do is divide the group into two, and we get them to choose a name after a famous black Nova Scotian.
Mm-hmm.
I think in your case we had the Simonses versus the Reverend Olivers. Yeah. And we'd just ask the questions, and points would be allocated for the different things. A lot of the facts that were asked in the quiz, even facts about Nova Scotia, there's a lot that they don't know, and a lot that's important for them to know, because this is their history, of black people living here, and it's unfortunate that in the past we haven't been able to tap on the resources of our history. But I think through this sort of thing, the more they become aware of it, the greater sense of strength and pride and dignity that they can develop from this. So the quiz, it was pretty interesting and in fact amusing. A lot of people, when they kind of knew an answer but couldn't place it right on the button, get right excited and stuff, and it was a lot of fun doing it. So we hope to widen that next year in terms of the Quest for Identity on TV, and we'll continue doing things like that within the youth groups at their meetings.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to putting together that Quest for Identity program. The viewers of our Black Horizons program, when we get the format worked out, we'll have an opportunity to see that. 9 or so minutes that we have left, the remaining time that we have left on today's program, I'd like to come back to you, the students. And when we talked to you earlier, I didn't spend much time talking to you about the schools. We talked about your groups and what you're doing and so on. But I'd like to go back and have you tell me a little bit about the environment in which your groups are working. How many students, how many black students in your group, and what your school situation is like. Inez, perhaps I'll start with you first. How many black students are there in Dartmouth High School? Is it a large group or a relatively small group?
Well, compared to QEH, it would be a relatively small group. That's 30 to 35 students.
I see. And what grade levels would they be in?
Well,
Dartmouth High is basically
10, 11, and 12.
10, 11, and 12,
Yeah.
right? And what is the situation like in the Dartmouth High School? How does the situation with say black students vis-a-vis the larger student body and so on?
Well, it's kind of isolated because you'd be sitting in the cafeteria and you're aware of the fact that people are staring at you. You don't know why, but I guess is the real thing is that you're different, right? And I noticed when a couple of my black friends came over to our school, they came over with a group of St. Pat's, right? We walked in the cafeteria, all eyes were on us, and we knew exactly the reason for that. But it's not easy, but we're getting along. But compared to St. Pat's, we have it a lot better because at least at our school we have a group and we can play our music if we want to. Whereas they can't because they take the records to the council room to play it and they scratch it and stuff like that and turn the music down low and everything like that. It's really bad over there, but I guess since we've been around the longest, we've overcame those obstacles, right? They're a relatively new group and it takes time to get over these things.
So you think that the situation of the position of the black students several years ago as opposed to what it is now has improved as a result of the group that you've established in Dartmouth High?
Yeah, well, not 100%, but it's getting there.
Still work to be done.
Yeah.
How are things in J.L. Isley, Michael? How many black students there, and what's the situation like in J.L. Isley?
Well, in our group, there are approximately 10 active members, probably about 15 students. But we're so new that we haven't got a lot of feedback from the student body. But what feedback we have got is well, either indifferent or supportive. We haven't got any bad feedback, so far so good.
Mm-hmm. Well, now the 15 students that are part of the group, would that be pretty much the entire black student body at J.L. Isley?
Yes.
So you're a relatively small group. J.L. Isley draws the students from what area, basically?
All of Spryfield and part of Herring Cove.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, Kristal, you're in QEH. What's the situation like in QEH? You must have quite a number of black students there, I believe.
Yeah, we have 120 black students approximately.
120.
Uh-huh.
And are all those 120 involved in your group?
No, we only have about 15 to 20 members.
15 or 20 members.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how would you? What accounts for that? Do you think?
Well, our meetings are after school, and when
Yes.
people get out, they just want to go right home and play basketball or do whatever they want to do, watch the stories, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't want to stick around after school.
All right. How long has your group been going now, Kristal?
Well, we just started late in April.
In April of this year, so it's a relatively new group as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
So given time, maybe you'll be able to convince the other 120 some odd students to become part of your group, perhaps.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Well, now, what's the situation like in QEH? As a black student at QEH, how are things?
Things are relatively fair. But I find that when you're in different classes and the word black comes up, like you may be the only one in your class, or you might have one or two friends with you who are black. And if the word black does come up, then you'll find eyes on you.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we overcame that. So
Mm-hmm. But
everything's up.
there are no problems there
Oh,
in
no.
terms of, on the social levels, say, black
no.
students, white students, and so on. There's no problem like that. Blacks are well integrated into the school. They're
Yeah.
quite involved. I guess they would be involved with school teams and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, David, I'd like to ask you in the few remaining moments that we have on today's program about the plans, if any, to expand the scope of the program, at least geographically speaking. Most of what you've been doing to this point has been in Halifax County. Is there any plans to broaden the programs to include other areas of the province?
Yeah, we certainly hope that we can hire more staff to widen the scope of the program. In fact, over the last few months, especially when we've had contact with other buff councils from other sectors of the province, their response to the program has been very enthusiastic, and a lot of them have asked if something like this could be in place in their communities, all over the province. Of course, the problem with that is that the time demands on myself for this area is quite high. Like, in addition to working with the youth groups, I also go on a lot of cultural awareness talks with classes and different schools outside of these youth groups, and also preparing research and doing different things. So which would mean that if we do have to widen the project, it would almost have to be with more staff. And of course the problem with that is that you have to get more funding. I will make myself available when possible to go to other areas and, devise a program for them. For example, I visited Amherst recently to talk at a school there, and we're hopefully going to be trying to set up some ongoing program with the youth, the black youth of that community. I will do that, but my main priority is to stabilize the metro area, and hopefully if we become stable and strong, that we can convince the funding agencies that this sort of thing should be widened, because there's certainly a need for it, sometimes even more so in some of the other sectors in the province. So I hope that the project will be expanded, and we will be devising plans so that it can be suited to any area in the province. So I hope, if it does, I think it'll be quite a significant thing for the black community in Nova Scotia.
One of the things I meant to touch on with you earlier in the program is and this, I guess, perhaps now that we've been discussing the possibility of expanding the organization, how would you keep these groups going? With, say, for example, if you have to become involved in another area of the province or whatever, how do you feel these groups will fare?
It varies. For example, at Dartmouth High, we've existed off and on for almost I think this is the 5th year now. And we've existed primarily because we've had former students from the school who've taken an active interest in maintaining the structure. Within the schools, we all have to have teacher advisors. There are very few black teacher advisors, so most are white, but that's no problem as long as someone understands our objectives. So I hope that in my absence, that the teacher advisors would be able to maintain the groups. We know there are a lot of problems related with that, especially with someone who doesn't completely understand the black community, but I hope that they will be able to survive that way. The other thing I hope for is that former students, when they do graduate, would be able to put in some time in coming back and just being there as an advisor. We've also been fortunate to have someone like Ricky Anderson, a very dynamic young man who has dedicated his time to the St. Pat's Black Student Society, and he serves as their advisor, and he goes to all their meetings, and he generally upkeeps that. So maybe with this sort of community volunteer sort of thing going on, we can maintain these groups, even if I have to move on to another area in trying to develop them. And I will always be in contact with these groups, and as they stabilize too, there's a lot more that they can do on their own. For example, Dartmouth High for almost 2 years now has existed without me being there, because my time has been taken up with the other groups. And we hope that if they do stabilize, that their dependence on outside help would be less, and that they will be able to basically handle their own affairs. So basically, I hope they all survive, but I think it's very important to have someone there, especially someone who has the resources to bring to them. Mm-hmm. And hopefully with volunteers from the community and teacher advisors, plus the staff at Buff, we can upkeep this program.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming along and joining us on the program. Kristal, Michael, Inez, David. I want to wish you all the best of luck with your various organizations. We want to thank you for watching our program today. Join us next week.